again. Hello, everyone. Ingo and myself, we're joining today from Cologne, Germany, where we have around 2 degrees and a cloudy sky. And if you would quickly type into the chat where you're joining in from, we usually have an international crowd from all over the world, from many countries. And we're curious where you're tuning in from today. Ukraine, I see Frankfurt, I see the same cloudy Netherlands, London actually, Oslo, Norway, United States, Pennsylvania, Stockholm, nice. Germany as well, Vienna, France, nice. Thank you all for joining again and welcome to this session. Today with me, my name is Jonathan. I'm leading the webinar series here at Buynomics for the past years. And with me together, how could it be else, is our co-founder and managing director and pricing expert, Dr. Ingo Reinhardt. And we are sure to, have a great session planned for you today. As always, if you have any questions or comments, please type them in the chat or the Q&A section anonymously, and we make sure to answer them. If you would go to the next slide, Ingo, then I quickly I have introduced us already. As you can see in the holiday spirit, we have it on the slides. I also have it on my head. And if you would go to the next slide quickly on what Buynomics is doing. So at Buynomics, we empower companies to make smarter and faster decisions in RGM. Using our virtual shopper technology, we can simulate real-world shopper behavior with up to 95% predictive accuracy. This allows businesses to holistically optimize all the RGM levers, pricing, promos, PPA, portfolio mix, and costs, considering competitive dynamics and retailer pressures. And with that, our customers achieve up to 4% higher gross profits and save up to 90% of this time spent on analysis. And if you want to discuss how we can help you tackle your RGM challenges, just book a demo with us on our website or write us an email directly. And with that, the stage is yours, Ingo. Enjoy.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan, for the introduction. And thanks, everyone, for joining to, I believe, the last webinar of this year. So I think we're aiming for a good final here. Something maybe a little bit more fun where we talk about myth in pricing in RGM. I think it's a very interesting topic. We're also very interested in your feedback. Are these the relevant myths that you have in mind, or are there others you're thinking about? Happy if you can write them in the chat during the webinar, or if you disagree about something we say, please also write it in the chat. We're happy to pick that up and address it maybe in a later webinar. And I think last week, for example, I was at a conference, and actually quite a few people who have seen, it appears to me, from our community who've seen our webinar. So I'm really happy about that. And we're really trying to improve what we do, cover a broad range of different topics. I think in the end, Jonathan will give an overview of what we've done this year and also highlight or give an outlook a little bit on what we're planning for the next year. So really looking forward to this webinar series, everything we're doing, and let's dive into the topic. So what we want to do to close the year with this webinar series is really look at pricing myth. And I think if you Google pricing myth, or if you look around what people post here and there are lots of myth everywhere. So lots, if you Google for it, you will find dozens of articles, and we're showing here a few of them about pricing myth. And typically they center around ideas like you should focus not on costs in pricing, but you should focus on value to the customer, something like that. So there are lots of these things, or something like what you're also seeing here in the upper left corner, things like there's a myth that small price changes already have can have a large impact on sales, and then the idea is that's not the case. You can always get away with little price changes. These are not the topics we want to address in this webinar. What we want to address are more things that we see, or where we see that are being used in many presentations, that most people probably agree to some extent. But if you look into it in more detail, and that's what we want to do here, is you see that there's a grain of truth in it, but they're not as they seem to be, at least in our view. And what we mean by that, I will show with one example that probably most of you have seen, and it's often used to justify pricing as a discipline. And the graph is something like this. And the idea is so how do we justify that pricing is important? And what's then the message is, if you have a 1% improvement in the different things that go into the profit of a company, they are the price, they are the variable costs, they are the sales volume, and they are the fixed cost. Then if you look at these four things, then pricing typically has the highest impact. And what it means, a 1% improvement is, in this context, or the mathematics underlying this example, are what happens when you increase the price by 1%, how does it affect this equation here at the profit formula here at the bottom, where you have profit is price minus variable costs times volume minus fixed cost. Very straightforward. So if you increase price here by 1%, and you apply typical price and variable cost volume relationships, then you get typically a 6% improvement in overall profit. If you do the same with variable costs, you get somewhere like around a 4% increase. If you do the same with volume improvement, so you sell 1% more units, you get a 2% increase, and typically fixed costs lead to a 1% improvement in profits. Where do these numbers come from? They typically come from an old paper, I think by McKinsey Partners, in the Harvard Business Review, I think somewhere in the 90s. And they computed, essentially what they did, they put in the average prices of Fortune 500 or a large group of companies. They put their profitability numbers, sales volumes, fixed cost ratios, and so on in this equation. And those are the values they achieved in the end. That's very straightforward, but I think what's often not very transparent about what is important, particularly in terms of the pricing, is that the assumption is that if you increase the price by 1%, there's no demand reaction. So essentially that you have a price elasticity of 0. So then this works, but as most of us know, but that makes our job both interesting and a bit difficult, is that we almost never have a price elasticity of 0. We might have a low price elasticity very close to 0 in some cases, and in some price changes, for example, if competitors also increase prices and so on, but typically it's not 0. But this is sort of the implicit assumption for this formula and what makes it work. If you have higher price elasticities, this can look a bit different. And this is all, I've seen this dozens or hundreds of times in different presentations. Many start with this graph to justify why pricing is important. Pricing is important, I think we all agree, but this graph is a little bit misleading because it assumes that the price elasticity is 0. So those are the myths we want to talk about here. And I think I just wanted to use this as a starting point because it's already a fairly important one, I think. All right, so before we go into the details, I think it always makes sense to make clear what we're talking about when we talk about myth. Makes sense to start with a brief definition, and typically a myth is an ancient story or set of stories, especially explaining the early history of a group of people or about natural events and facts. So if we talk about pricing myths or revenue growth management myth, then this includes typically some early understandings, stories for us as a community that many of us believe in or hold true, and that in some cases are helpful, and in others probably are not helpful. So just like myth, some of them are try to explain how we got here, how the world was made in ancient Greek mythology, includes stories around Uranus, Gaia, Zeus, and so on. And in pricing, it includes, I would say, stories around what role costs play, what role customers' willingness to pay, and other things play. So this is really what we're talking about here. And for us, we want to look at particularly 4 different myths. And if you disagree, if you see others being relevant, please write them in the chat, and we're happy to discuss them or maybe address them in a later webinar next year. So one myth, and is, I would say, the opposite of the typical myth, is that the myth is, as we formulated, costs do not matter in pricing. So that's the myth. And actually, we do believe that costs, of course, matter in pricing. Then the second myth, pricing is all about value to the customer. We'll explain what that means. Then another myth is often used probably more implicitly. Price elasticity is a single number. So this is what most of us, I think, when we use them, assume when we get a table from provider with a list of price elasticities, we say product A has a price elasticity of -2, product B has a price elasticity of -3, and so on. Then we sort of assume that a price elasticity for a specific product is just a single number. And another myth is also when we use surveys, different studies, and so on, that where people are asked more like in a laboratory setting about their preferences, their willingness to pay, and so on. So we take these results for granted and sort of assume that the behavior we observe in these studies are equally valid, or we can easily transfer them to the real world. And I think what all of these myths have in common is they really serve to simplify our reality and make it easy to work with different concepts like the ones we're addressing here: costs, value, price elasticity, and so on. All right, let's go into these in detail. So the myth that costs don't matter and it's all about value to the customer, I think it's straightforwardly clear if you look at the mathematics underlying profit optimization, that can't be true. So if we have, just as an example, it could be different with different demand functions. Here, a linear demand function. So if price goes up, sales volume goes down. And what we see here is that the profit optimal price depends on the demand, the A and B in this relationship, but it also depends on the cost here, right? So you have the profit optimal price is half the cost minus this term, but because B, the slope here is typically negative, this term is positive. So you're using half the cost as a basis, and then you're adding something based on this demand function. And what it also tells you, if, for example, you have a cost increase in this case, so you have costs of 100, and because of the equation here, you have a profit optimal price in the status quo of 200 with a margin of 50%. That means in the profit optimum, you would have a price elasticity of -2. If the costs increase from 100 to 110, here that already means that you need to pass on half of that price increase. So you would have to go, if you're before in the profit optimal price and you want to move again to the profit optimal price, you would have to increase your price from 200 to 205, right? So already clear that the myth that costs don't matter, it cannot be true if you just look at the mathematics of it. And the specifics here that you pass on half of the cost increase is specific to a linear demand function. If, for example, this demand function was exponential, looking like this, where you have a constant price elasticity, then the cost increase has a different effect. So in that case, with constant price elasticity, you would keep your margin constant. So if prices increase by 10%, you would also have to increase your price by 10%. So in that case, you would have to go not from 200 to 205, but from 200 to 220. Already indicating that if your costs increase, it's not only important to know the cost increase, but also know the shape or the type of your demand function. to make sure that you go to the or remain in the profit optimal price. So this is important. Here we have a rather modest price increase, but for people working with commodity prices or using commodities where prices have fluctuated greatly, something like cocoa, this is quite a different game. Has been in the last year or so, where, for example, cocoa price per ton have increased from something like $2,000 to $12,000 in early 2024, then dropped again to somewhere around 7,000 and now back up at 11. So there's lots of volatility. And the question is always, how do you react with your pricing based on that? And that includes, on the one hand, this the mathematics here, which certainly consider cost, but also some strategic component about how much do you actually want, or how often can you actually make price changes. So it's a bit more complicated, but costs certainly play a role in pricing and should always play a role in your pricing. The next myth, I think, is when people talk about value to the customer, they often really simplify and only think, and really pay attention to that when I hear presentations and so on, that when you say things like the customer thinks this, the customer would be willing to pay another €5 for this feature. It sort of assumes that there is just one single customer that represents the full demand. But what we always have when we, for example, use these demand functions, that really means there is not one customer, but there are lots of customers. Here's one with a very high willingness to pay. Here's one with a very low willingness to pay. And so this simplification, this is the value to the customer. The one customer can really be very misleading because customers are not always all the same. We sort of implicitly know that, but it's really also important to consider the distribution, the way different preferences are distributed across the customer group. Building on that is if typically the next step, if from going from this is what the customer wants, is looking at customer segments. So that's probably the next level of complexity, where you say, okay, there's not one customer, but there are, let's say in this example, you have 4 customers, and they have different preferences, willingness to pay, for example, for 2 features, features A and B. And often, and I've seen that in many projects in my previous lives, you see a result presented this way, where someone says, okay, there are 4 segments. There are those, and in this case, they represent the majority who have a high preference for feature A and feature B. There are a few who like one feature but not the other one, and there are some who dislike both features. And if you take a look at the raw data underlying this, it typically looks much more like the left side here, where most of them are somewhere in the middle, and there are no clear segments. And very often, like these segments, there are like the price sensitive ones, there are different other segments. They are really often, to some extent, forced into the data, and the real data underlying what we're seeing here is much more like that. And it really makes sense in these cases, now that we have proper technology who doesn't have to simplify by looking at 3 or 4 customer segments, but can look at the whole distribution. It really often makes sense to really consider the distribution and optimize your portfolio for that distribution, and not some often oversimplified customer segmentation as we have here on the right side. Also, and this is the last on the customer differentiation, I think something that I've always also seen quite a lot. When someone's promoting price differentiation, in general, I would say there's nothing wrong with price differentiation where it makes sense, but it's usually justified with a picture like this. If you look here at the left side, it's a typical profit optimization graph. You have again here this linear demand with a maximum sales of €3,000. You have a maximum price of $150, sorry, and you have units of 3,000, sorry, 3,000 units, not dollars or euros, and you have a maximum price of 150 where no one buys anymore. And with this demand function, you have product costs of 50 per unit, and at a price of 100, you would sell 1,000 units here. And that is, in this case here, the profit optimum, and you make a total profit if you sell everything in an undifferentiated way at this price, you make $50,000. If you manage to sell to every single shopper with a willingness to pay above your costs at their maximum willingness to pay here. So this one would pay 50, this one pays 51 and so on. And the one with the highest willingness to pay pays 150. Then you go from this rectangle to the triangle here, which is has twice the size. So you go from 50,000 to 100,000. So that looks very attractive, and that's usually what's used to justify price differentiation. But there's one problem with that. The one problem or challenge first is that you need to be very certain to identify the one with $150 willingness to pay here. Because if you ask $150 from someone who's actually only at $100, that shopper you might lose, right? And with that, you lose the potential to sell to someone at a price of 100 if that product that costs you only 50 to make, right? So you need to be fairly certain of your ability to identify the willingness to pay of different shoppers. And we simulated that in this example. You need to have roughly at least a correlation of 95%, so 0.95 between the actual willingness to pay of a shopper and what you guess it is. So, and if you Google correlation 95, that's almost a straight line, right? So you need to be very good in predicting shoppers' willingness to pay if you want to really improve versus just the single price. There are, of course, cases with self-selection, or you can negotiate where people reveal their willingness to pay, where price differentiation makes sense. But this essentially serves as a warning that it's not that as straightforward as is suggested by the simple graph here. Let's go to the next one. Price elasticity is one that we have already touched a few times in this webinar. And usually, as I said, when people use price elasticities, they often come from a table where you have product A, price elasticity -2, product B -3, product C 1.5, and so on, -1.5, and you have these different values. But if you look at probably the simplest demand function here, the linear demand, then of course it doesn't have the same price elasticity everywhere, right? In particular, it goes from 0 to -infinity to essentially it takes every value somewhere here across the relevant price range. So it's difficult to say this product has a price elasticity of X. And this is even in a world where there's only this one product, when in reality, we typically have a range of different products or a portfolio of products. And it, of course, makes a difference if you just change the price of a single product or if you change the price of your whole portfolio. Or if you change your prices and your competitors also change prices. So there are lots of things going on in reality. So just working with the table of elasticities, maybe even one that you use over many years, that's a very strong simplification, because price elasticities can change quite a bit if something happens in the market or you have different products changing prices in the same direction. So it's much better to have a model that's able to consider this complexity, that is able to give you different elasticities for different price changes or different elasticities for a single or a portfolio price change, for example. The next one I want to talk about is the relationship between things you see in a clean lab, where you ask people about their willingness to pay. You do like Van Westendorp or other surveys like this, and what you then observe in reality. And here is essentially a very simple comparison, where we looked at the results from a survey together with the results from the real sales results. And let's start with the survey first. So here in this case, the blue line, and the product is essentially a chocolate snack that's somewhere around €1 price here. And we asked at different price points, would you buy this product at 50 cents, 60 cents, and so on, different price points, up to 130 something. Then we reported here the share of shoppers who would say, okay, at this price, I would buy it. And as always, you see here a large drop at the price threshold of 1, right? So lots of people would buy the product at 90 cents, but not at €1. And often in surveys like this, you see a threshold at 30 or 40%, quite significant. But when you then look at the real sales for a product like this, the threshold is much weaker. It's still there if you go into the details, but it's much, much weaker. And there are, of course, different reasons for that. I think the most relevant one is in surveys, you typically look at a single product. And it's the question people answer in the lab is, do you want to buy this, or do you not want, or do you want to buy nothing at all? Whereas in reality, the question is typically much more, do you want to buy this product, or do you want to buy something else? Because most people who look at a shelf willing to buy from a certain category end up with a purchase somewhere in the category. So, and this shift in question produces different results. In this case, the price threshold becomes much less relevant than in the case where there's only one product in the survey. And these differences are really important to understand, because if you expect this large price threshold here at €1, you would be somewhat disappointed, or not disappointed, depending on what you're aiming for, when you then observe what happens with the price change of, for example, from 90 cents to €1. So these were the myths that we find most relevant. Again, if you think we missed something, or you would highlight others, then please write them in the chat. We're happy to address them later on or in the next session of this type. But I think what we should do as a field is to go through an evolution that we're also going through in other areas, where we're moving from like anecdotes and myth, many of the things, as I try to explain, on value and price elasticities, often are somewhat more like anecdotes or myth, more to a proper discipline that uses proper technology to assess what happens in the market and helps us make better pricing and revenue growth management decisions. Similar to what Jonathan in the beginning highlighted, what we're doing here at Buynomics, where we have essentially built a technology that allows our shoppers to really simulate what happens with all kinds of changes in a category, and that's triggered or based on our virtual shopper technology that is much more differentiated and allows you to look, for example, at differentiated price elasticities, what happens if you change one price versus all the prices in a category, and so on. So I think this is really an important move from a world of more simplified concepts, price elasticities, customer segmentations, using MIST and so on, that are somewhat true, but not all of them, to really a much intense work on technology. And of course, we're not the only ones claiming that. If you look for concepts like Gen AI and pricing revenue management, everyone pretty much in the field who has something to say will have talked about it. And this will be my closing remark here, is I think there are already also some myth forming on that frontier, particularly in the use of technology. And I think the one that I found most fascinating here is I would call the halo effect in generative AI. And that is because things like ChatGPT are very good at language tasks. So helping you write an email, helping you summarize text and so on. They're very good in that. And many people from that infer that they're also good at other tasks, like helping you with your price decisions. But that's typically not the case. The technology is really not made for pricing. So if you ask it, about basic concepts, elasticity, should I increase, decrease prices in a simple example, it really struggles with that. And I think we need to be careful moving forward that we're not replacing our old myth with new myth in the new context, but find a way to properly use the new technologies. And with that, Jonathan, I'll hand over back to you.
Yes, thanks, Ingo. Great insights again. I think we got some questions in the chat and then the Q&A section. And I would like to start with the one from Andrea, who asks, how can you apply this concept of willingness to pay to a FMCG company? Only with price pack architecture, or is there any other way?
Say again, I think I missed part of it.
How can you apply the concept of willingness to pay to a FMCG company? Only with price pack architecture, or is there any other way or lever?
Yeah, so I mean, I think we need to clarify what we mean by willingness to pay. So what's really going on, if you look at a category with different shoppers and so on, is that shoppers have willingness to pay or preferences for different product attributes, right? So if you are looking at a coffee, what are the attributes? It's the type of coffee, the taste of it, it's the size of the cup. Is it like a proper cup, or is it a paper cup? Would now also say that the temperature of the coffee should be a value around. So that what I'm saying is there are different things, and different shoppers have different preferences for different attributes that are relevant. And there are, of course, very different ways to play with that. You can just have one product and look at different pricings. You can have one product and look at different features. Does it make sense to have the coffee cup a bit bigger or smaller? Should it be a proper cup? Should it be a paper cup, and so on? What works best? Or, and that's more the PPA price pack architecture argument, does it make more sense to cover a broader range of different preferences, right? By having different sizes of coffees, by different types of different flavors, different cup types, and so on. And what is important here is also with PPA, there are many simple heuristics how you price. So with larger sizes, you should probably decrease the price per gram or per milliliter in the case of coffee. Simple heuristics, but what you actually want to do is you want to see, if I have different products, what are the sales, profit, and revenue implications of it. And what you would like to have is a way to, for example, iterate through different alternatives and see what makes most sense for you as a company, what's most profitable, or what leads to the largest market share, whatever you're aiming for. And this is really how it works. PPA is certainly one way of addressing it, but you can also address it, of course, with price changes in an existing portfolio. Happy to discuss further if you're more interested.
Great, thanks for your answer. I think it ties hand in hand with another question from Danielle. How can you balance the precision of price differentiation with the complexity it introduces operationally?
Yeah, different inputs come into it. I think what you need from the market side, you need an understanding of the benefits of differentiation. And internally, you need to be able to ideally quantify the disadvantages of differentiation. And these two things need to be balanced, right? If in some of the previous slides where we looked at costs, we often simplify by just having a simple unit cost. But of course, there's also cost of complexity that need to go into this equation, and you need to bring these two sides together and to make a good decision. So pricing, the market side shows you the benefits, and what you get internally gives you the downside, and these two things need to be balanced.
Great, thanks for your answer. And then the last question I got here from Luke from the chat is, how can you effectively integrate AI insights into current traditional RGM decision-making processes?
Yeah, I mean, there's of course, a range of different ways, and it really depends on the company, ranging from not really having changes at all in the processes and just getting better elasticity or better insights on how sales change, to using an advanced solution to helping you really optimize, finding the best price structure, finding the best PPA setup, and so on. And then also, for example, I think what's also interesting as a topic is AI can help bridge the gap between the company strategy on the one hand and the price changes you make. What do I mean by this? There are many things that a company wants to address in its strategy, and it's can be difficult to address that in your pricing. Simple things like the company, part of its strategy is they would never want to price above a certain competitor, which can be difficult to like implement in the team, but an AI can make sure that that's the case. Or for some reason, a company will never do 99 prices, but only 95 prices. Those are simple things, but they can also be more complex ones, like better understanding or consistently understanding over time the trade-off between growth and profitability that comes from the strategy, and then make sure that that's implemented across categories, across channels, whatever degree of differentiation is relevant. And those are cases where AI can help. Also, of course, with selling stories and other things that can be relevant. I think we're more at the beginning than at the end of what's possible here.
I think so too. And we will answer the questions in the Q&A section later on. I have one more from the chat, which is in a B2B setting where one doesn't have a robust inflow of competitor or market data, and where there are multiple people who are involved in the decision-making process, is there a robust way to look at price increases?
Yeah, of course, B2B it's more challenging. As you point out, the lack of transparency is, of course, a big issue. But there are things you can address with technology, like consistency, for example, across different cases that can be addressed with the technology. And of course, often the proper technology can do more with the same information that is currently been managed with very simplistic tools, like we pointed out before. But this is not something we're doing here at the moment. So I know what the topic is about, but I have less recent and practical knowledge on this at the moment.
Okay, great. And I think this wraps up the question section. If we go to the next slide, I think, okay, that's where the questions, and the next one is our RGM maturity framework, which we work on the past couple of months. And even on the next slide, you can scan the QR code and take an RGM maturity assessment for yourself with a couple of questions there. It shouldn't take longer than 5 or 10 minutes. And in the end, you get a result, and you can and actionable insights actually. And let me see if I have the link right here. Here I have it. So I can post it in the chat for anybody that is on mobile right now. Here it is. And then, yes, the year is over. We had 18 webinars this year, at least in-house webinars, not counting our presence on conferences and partner webinars, with more than 10 speakers, over 5,000 registrants, over 2,000 attendees. So thank you to each and every one of you of having those insightful discussions. It's always a pleasure to interact with the chat. I think you can agree there, Ingo, to also host and interact with everyone. For the upcoming year, we have a couple of webinars and sessions planned. We're starting in January 22nd with the topic of cost pressure. So tackling rising costs and some strategies how to protect your margins in the upcoming year, which was a webinar topic that was highly requested in the last ones. Let me quickly share the link to register to it as also in the chat. 1 second. Here it is. And we also make sure we send the follow-up email just tonight with the recording, with the slides, with the RGM maturity assessment, and with the registration button for the next webinar. A little hint, we also have a panel discussion planned for the first time next year with expert speakers from Unilever, for example. So stay tuned and watch your email inbox to see when this registration window will open. And yeah, again, thank you, Ingo. Thank you, everyone that listened in today and over the year.
Yes.
And hope to see you next year. Happy holidays and Happy New Year.
Yeah, same for me. Yeah, it was a pleasure. Looking forward to the next year. Yeah, have a good close to the year. Hope you reach all your goals, and then find some time and then have a good start into the next year. Looking forward to seeing you there again. Thanks, Jonathan, and have a good weekend. Bye.